All right, everyone. Looks like still have a few folks joining us. Got a ton of registrations for this webinar. Really appreciate the support and interest in everybody's favorite topic, CMMC, and what it means for service providers, consultants, anybody supporting clients in the defense industrial base. Get started here in about 30 seconds. All right. For those of you just trickling in, appreciate you joining. My name is Patrick Costello. I am a partner account manager here at Cynomi. Definitely saw some familiar names on the attendee list, so appreciate the partners I work with jumping on. Anybody else who's joined, happy to have you here. Goal for today is to have a educational session on CMMC for MSPs and really anybody that's engaging with clients in the defense industrial base. So what you need to know, common pitfalls to avoid, questions that have been answered by folks that have been doing this maybe a little longer than you have. So it's going to be a great session. I mentioned to the panelists before we jumped on here live. I've already had two conversations today with partners about CMMC specifically. I think they're both on the line here, so I'm happy to continue the conversation. CMMC is opening some real revenue opportunities with defense contractors. I think everybody kind of recognizes that there is a massive addressable market that is going to be subject or is subject to these requirements and is going to need a level 2 certification. But you need to be intentional about how those services are being delivered. Make sure that you're not going to be liable for certain outcomes that may come from the certification process, and really just not treating it like another compliance checklist. So, there's a few, I think, folks, types of folks in the audience that this session is really going to, cater to. It's those MSPs or MSSPs that are currently supporting or planning to support clients in the defense industrial base that need CMMC Level 2. And for those service providers who may have clients that are raising their hand saying, hey, we need help, and trying to decide, is this going to be a growth opportunity for us, or is this something that we should avoid? So just a quick rundown of what we're going to cover today. I do have a couple slides. I promise not too many, but I'll give quick overview of the history of CMMC, kind of where we came from, how we got here, an overview of CMMC 2.0 with a focus on CMMC Level 2. And then we'll get into some of the decisions that service providers should be making if you're planning on offering CMMC related services, and sharing some real world lessons from our speakers that we have on the line. So just by way of quick introductions, we're joined by Wilbert Shett of Logos Systems. He has sat through numerous CMMC assessments and DIBCAC assessments. He is a lead CMMC certified assessor, and I really appreciate his perspective on this topic. I think it's a little different than most of us here on a day-to-day basis. So he's going to help us cut through the noise and share what assessors are actually looking for during that certification process, especially for Level 2. And we also have Mike Cardenas joining us as CTO and founder at MC3 Technologies, calling in from beautiful Hawaii. Mike is a Cyber AB registered practitioner. MC3 is an RPO. He's been through CMMC assessments with his clients, brings hands-on experience from delivering CMMC programs, and helping not only his clients, but also MSPs in his area kind of through this process. So again, some great perspectives on the call here. I myself spent the 2 years prior to joining Cynomi at an MSP that was primarily focused on CMMC Level 2. So more pre-sales and scoping from my background. So hope you guys have some good questions that you can throw out at us once we get into a live Q&A. All right, moving on. So quick history lesson for those of you who have been paying attention for a while. Quick recap. But the DFARS clause, DFARS 7012, went into effect in 2017. So this is what established the requirement for defense contractors who were storing, processing, or transmitting CUI to actually implement NIST 800-171 and self-attest to meeting those requirements. Fast forward to 2021, CMMC 2.0 was announced. The DoD kind of pivoted or intended on pivoting from the self-attestation to a formal certification process after realizing that most of the folks in the DIB weren't actually meeting the requirements like they said they were. So for those of us who followed the rulemaking process, it did take a while to get the finalization of the CMMC program, actually have it be codified into law, which is what we had in 2024 and 2025, respectively. So 32 CFR set the rules for the actual program. It defined the requirements and policies for assessments, and it also designated the Cyber AB as the governing body over the assessment certification process. 48 CFR is the enforcement of these requirements kind of within the procurement process. So this is where we're already starting to see, although there is a phased rollout, there are prime contractors who are putting in their solicitations, you need to have a CMMC Level 2 certification to be awarded this contract. So really creating some urgency within the defense industrial base. But the key thing to remember here is CMMC is, kind of the buzz topic right now. But that's the certification mechanism. The underlying requirements come from NIST 800-171. CMMC as a program is really defining how those requirements are assessed, who can assess them, when is a certification required, basically everything that the DoD wants to see, right? All right, one more slide for the time being. Promise we'll move quickly here. So again, quick recap for folks on the line about CMMC Level 2 and the 3 levels. I'm going to put Will on the spot. CMMC Level 1 versus Level 2. Just quick TLDR, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, essentially, level one is the financial transaction information. So purchase orders, what they're buying, what kind of quantities. It's the financial transactions, and there's not sensitive data in the sense of higher security requirements. So there's only 15 requirements there, and that's why the underlying law is just the FAR clause. That's just the acquisition. And so a lot of that's going to be focused around like the ERPs and the financial systems, but few controls. Pretty much anybody that deals with the government has in any acquisition form is going to be at least level one. And so that's the baseline. Everyone's going to be level one. And then move into level two. That's when we're getting into the specific data type of the CUI and the CUI protection. And so between the two, I think the estimate was like 80,000 needing a level two. But if you sell to the DOW in any way, shape, or form, you're going to be level one at least. And that's including the GSA mass contracts and things like that.
Perfect. And I mean, in terms of like you mentioned FCI, CUI, I think there are a few things that we should touch on, especially for the audience on the call. Whether it's the actual DIB company seeking certification or your role as a consultant or an MSP, when or how do you come into scope as an external service provider and get pulled into an assessment?
If you do any one of the controls, So when we look at the 110 requirements, or when we get into the assessment, the objectives, right, the 320 objectives, if you perform any of those for the client, you're pulled in to answer for that. And there's requirements around documentation as a service provider. But consultants, if a consultant is coming in and performing any of those actions, like a risk assessment or a tabletop, anything that you are outsourcing, that your client's outsourcing, if you're performing any of those actions as a service provider, external service provider is not just MSPs, MSSPs, it's anybody external to the company that is performing any of these actions, including subcontractors and the like. They're considered an ESP. So consultants, subcontractors, MSPs, MSSPs, they're all considered ESPs under this rule.
Perfect. So if you're working on these engagements with clients, definitely helps to have your house in order. Where are we going to be sharing responsibility with our client? Um, where are they potentially inheriting responsibilities from us? And an assessor is going to point their finger and say, "Hey, tell me about how this is being performed." Um, Mike, for any of the attendees on the call who are working with a variety of different frameworks. I think Cynomi is obviously a cybersecurity and compliance focused platform. So partners I work with may be supporting clients with ISO, SOC 2, HIPAA, CGIS. How is CMMC and NIST 800-171 different?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Patrick. Yeah, and thank you for having me here. Hey, we've been working with defense contractors. We've been a defense contractor ourselves for about 20 plus years now. And so when we start talking about compliance, many of the frameworks that we typically are used to, like things like HIPAA, like CGIS, they're self-attestation, right? They're things that you must do, you must document, but no one's really coming in and auditing you unless something really happens, right? Whereas CMMC is not just a framework, it's also a condition of contract award for, Department of Defense or Department of War contractors, right? And coming along with especially the level two requirements is going to require that an independent third-party assessor like Will and his team come in to audit the entire scope of that boundary, right? So of course, that's the client's systems, that's their documentation. But and like Will said, anything that you touch as an MSP or MSSP, that's also in scope. And now you are part of the assessment as well. And you have to come in to attest to those controls and assessment objectives that you have hands-on with, right? So I think unlike everything else, this has a very strong enforcement policy. And for your clients who you're supporting, this is make or break for their business, right? If they pass, they get their contract. If they do not pass, then they are no longer going to get, DOW contracts.
Perfect. It's a great segue. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. I promise just a couple slides. I think it's a good segue into, like you mentioned, anything that an MSP or MSSP is going to touch. And obviously, we're using a lot of technology to manage these specific functions. Um, Considerations that the average service provider should be making about their tool stack. What was your experience like when you went through that process?
I think there's definitely a lot of things that an MSP or an MSSP must consider before, diving into this market, right? So my experience is that most of us, MSPs, MSSPs, they're very good at what they do, right? And so that's not really something that we come across as more so we have to kind of look at three things, right? Number one is do we understand when we are in scope as an external service provider, right? So most MSPs don't realize that they're in scope until a client's assessor starts talking about things like your RMM access, your backup systems, right? Your ticketing systems, all the things that you use day to day to manage your client's security posture, those are now all in scope, right? And so if any of those systems are storing, processing, or transmitting FCI or CUI data, they are in scope. If your employees are remoting into your client machines and they're starting to see, documents on the screen, and those documents are FCI or CUI, now you inherit a lot of controls. You are seeing that sensitive data, and therefore all the systems that you use within your MSP or MSSP is now in scope of that assessment, right? So that's kind of number one. If your tools and your people can touch the system, then those controls will be questioned, and you must be ready to prove and defend those controls under audit. Right? That's kind of number one, understanding when you're in scope and what systems are in scope. The second part that I feel is the probably the more difficult part for most MSPs is, can we explain our shared responsibility, and can we do it in writing in a way that's defensible, right? So am I defining all the services and tools that I use? Am I defining what controls from CMMC that aligns with? Am I now defining how I utilize these tools to meet these requirements, right? And taking a step further, there's things that an external service provider does that they entirely own, right? Like the backups. But there's other things that they own a part of, but then the customer is responsible for the other part of that, right? And there's other things that are entirely on the customer and themselves, things like HR onboarding processes, right? Background checks and things like that. So for an MSP coming into this, you have to kind of go through all those controls, define what is your shared responsibility for each of those things, right? So again, and I can't say it enough, it's the documentation that's the most important part of this, because yes, you will get called into the audits. You will be asked to defend those controls. And the best way to do that is with clear documentation and clear procedures that you can show the assessor quickly when in that room, right? So
Yeah.
sum it up, if your
And I used,
responsibility, then it's down, right? You got
yeah,
this.
And
it's
I can,
something yeah, sorry, go ahead, Will.
no, I was just going to say, I can give a scenario from the assessor's point of view, especially
Yeah,
for
perfect.
shared responsibility, because I think that's a very key. So when an assessor is doing an assessment, is they're going to look at the system security plan. They're going to read the narrative of how that control is implemented. If in that narrative it says my MSP or my MSSP does this for me, right? Then what they're going to want to do is they're going to want to see their contract. They're going to want to see their shared responsibility matrix. And because that's what you're contractually obligated to, and the shared responsibility matrix is what you're saying, like that delineation in the sand. This is what the client's responsible for. This is what we're responsible for. And then based on the contract and the shared responsibility matrix, they're then going to turn and ask the MSP or the service provider to walk through how you do it and then to prove in evidence and artifacts that it's done. And so that's where your policies, procedures, and artifacts and what you do on the back end is the MSP or MSSP. That's where that comes into scope. So it's a chain. So it starts with the SSP. When that gets handed off, it goes to that shared responsibility and contract, and then over to your own artifacts and evidence as the service provider.
I think I used to, not to scare anyone, use it as a sales tactic, or at least a point of conversation when I was engaging with clients that I was trying to sell compliance focused managed services to for CMMC. They might say, I'm already working with a service provider. We're happy. We've been working with them for 10 years. One of the first questions I would ask was, have they shared their shared responsibilities matrix with you? And most of the time they would say no. And if they said yes, I would say, are they aligned to the 320 assessment objectives or just the 110 NIST controls? And we could clearly show, I mean, it was again documented because we are going through a lot of the certifications with our clients. Here's our SRM. We're owning X% of these responsibilities. The other 20% is on you, client. Here are all the things we do, the information that we need from you. And it helped us build a lot of trust in the pre-sales process. So just throwing that out there, there are some larger players in the space that are trying to grab as much market share as they can. I'm sure you've seen them on LinkedIn. They charge a premium for their services, but those are some of the questions that you may get from clients. Oh, hey, so and so told me to ask you about your SRM. So extremely important to keep that in mind. I think another thing that comes up, maybe a good question for you, Will, is FedRAMP, FedRAMP moderate equivalency, gov SKUs on certain products. From an assessor standpoint, what are your thoughts?
So if the system is in the cloud and it stores, processes, or transmits CUI data, And so I say the data because it's also things like sandboxing for antivirus, things like that. Anytime it touches cloud in any way, shape, or form, it has to be FedRAMP. And so with FedRAMP, there's FedRAMP moderate and high, and there's FedRAMP equivalency. And so the definition of FedRAMP equivalency is they have gone through the entire process of FedRAMP. They've had an audit from a 3PAO with no findings because the guidance from DOW was zero findings, zero POAM. And once they do all of that, then they can do claim equivalency. So during an assessment as an assessor, we go in and any controls that have inheritance. So my cloud service provider is doing this and there's an inheritance. We look at that SSP and then we're like, okay, where is the FedRAMP package? So the client is going to have to go get that FedRAMP package. And then we have to examine that what they have matches that FedRAMP package. And so, like the example of one of the questions in the Q&A was Microsoft. So Microsoft specifically calls out in their FedRAMP package that the only way you can inherit any of these controls is if you're on a government SKU. So you can't be on Microsoft commercial. So, but we look at that. And then if there's the FedRAMP equivalence, the way we look at that as an assessor is that company that is claiming that inheritance. So this is Prevail and a lot of the ones in the space. They actually have to provide that entire body of evidence for a FedRAMP assessment. And then we look at that to one, say, okay, a third party assessor looked at this, they passed it, we've got that certificate. The only thing they don't have is the government sponsor on the inside. That's the only difference between equivalent and FedRAMP is that sponsorship. And then we look at that body of evidence and say, okay, we agree that this meets that FedRAMP equivalency requirement for you to inherit those controls.
And then there's maybe, I think this is a good question we could answer live while we're on the topic from Jennifer. Um, SPD, security protection data, and even SPA. So if there's no CUI, but we have SPD or SPA, CMMC 2 still in scope as
It,
an
it
ESP.
is, it is, but it's you need to go through the controls and then which ones are applicable to a security protection asset. So just because there's no CUI on it, that SPA, that security asset is protecting CUI. So you still need to have it in an asset inventory. You still need to see what controls are going to be applicable to it. And so there may not be CUI on it, but you're still going to have to show how you're protecting it. So this security asset, is it local accounts or tied to an identity provider? If it's an identity provider, what groups? How are you assigning users to those groups? So just because it's SPA does not mean it's out of scope. It's out of scope for CUI data, but how you protect it is still needs to be assessed. It's not, in the CMMC world, we have four classifications, right? We've got CUI asset, security protection asset, specialized asset, and out of scope, and then government property. Sorry, so there's five. So when you have that asset inventory, anything that is not out of scope, anything, including security assets, still have to be followed through the 110 controls to then see what's applicable and apply it. So multi-factor, those things. But that's kind of a misnomer is just because it's security protection doesn't mean it's not in scope or the MSP, MSSP is not in scope. It's you still have to answer on how you're meeting those controls for what's in the asset inventory.
Perfect. And while we're on the topic of scope, just quick blurb on scoping. Um, I think you've probably seen a few different implementations. Will, Michael, same to you. Um, I think the rule of thumb that we always followed at my previous employer was keep the scope as tight and small as possible. We were also primarily implementing in enclaves. There's obviously some more complication that can come in when you're pulling in OT. If you're creating CUI throughout the manufacturing process, if you're a manufacturer, maybe just a few thoughts from you, Michael, on scoping, and then Will, feel free to pile on.
Yeah, I think scoping is the most important thing, right? Of course, I advocate for, how do we get this done quickly, efficiently? And I think a lot of our clients are concerned with cost, right? So the obvious answer is to descope as much of your environment as possible. If you can do it with the cloud enclave, that's great, right? Some of the gotchas that I see though is we deal with a lot of construction and engineering out here in the Pacific. And so cloud enclaves sound great for people like that. But once you start to create the CUI, which is building plans and specifications, and you start to have to print them out to take with you to the job sites, that'll quickly expand your scope, right? And so this is not just an IT thing, it's how you do things in HR and admin. It's also how you do things in your execution of the work that you're doing. So are you printing things? If you're printing things, where are you keeping it, right? How do you secure that? Do you have policies and procedures to support that, right? And so yeah, scope can quickly get away from me. So understanding that, thoroughly with your clients is critical at the beginning.
So I'll just add to the scoping. So I think the term enclave gets thrown around, and I want to clarify it from an assessor's point of view when we look at the scope. So a system in definition of NIST, the way a system, when we come in and assess, we're either doing the enterprise wide, which is the entire company, we're doing a business unit, which is a subdivision, or we're doing an enclave. And an enclave doesn't always mean a cloud enclave. So there's a lot of enclave solutions that are a cloud enclave. An enclave can be if I were to put it into an on-premise term, anyone that's worked in the defense space has heard the term SCIF, right? A SCIF is an enclave within a facility, right? It's its own little containerized environment. And so enclaves can be on premise. And so the assessment scope, when we say enclave, we're not just saying a cloud enclave. We're saying if you've got a single computer on a facility in a locked room and that is your enclave, the assessment scope is still an enclave. So I just want to clarify a term because
Yeah.
I think that gets lost in the translation is enclave is not always cloud.
Right. And even if there is some cloud component, like it was built in GCC High or Azure Gov, and you have, virtual machines, there's still the question of, again, how are folks accessing those? Is there data that's potentially going to be pulled out, like, the physical CUI comment that Michael made. So again, just considerations to make, and like this is a topic scoping that we could probably spend a full hour on. So, do your due diligence, have conversations with, other folks in the ecosystem if you're unsure about, where some of these fall. So, I mean, again, we could keep going on these topics. I think it just illustrates kind of how this is a little different from some of the other, compliance requirements you may already be supporting clients with. It's not it's obviously not just a checklist. I think, you have to ask yourself, is this a strategic opportunity for my business? And like Michael is in a hot spot where there's a lot of, Navy presence, and thus, contractor work supporting the Navy. I have partners in San Diego. Also a hotbed. There's plenty across the U.S. So I do think it begs the question: are we going to change our tool stack, spend the time to understand these requirements to support one or two clients that have to go through this process? Or is there a larger opportunity for us to, really understand this, become a subject matter expert, and have this be a, strategic opportunity for us to go after new business in the space and not necessarily just, helping our current client base. But I do think, the important thing to keep in mind, Will has echoed this, the reason why these requirements are in place is largely to protect the warfighter, right? We're protecting controlled unclassified information. There's been instances of breaches, leaks, nation states, creating carbon copies of some of our technology. The intention is to, yes, meet the needs of your clients, provide value, but we have to make sure that we're thinking about this the right way. So I think having some of those conversations internally is important. Um, On that topic of kind of again being in a hot spot, Michael, you've been a defense contractor yourself. I know we talked a little bit about everybody's other, the other favorite requirement, NIST 853. How did you kind of fall into the CMMC space?
So I feel like I've been talking about CMMC for a decade now. It feels like it. Um, I was a defense contractor. We did DoD cybersecurity compliance for their IT and OT systems, and so we wrote, we did the assessments. We wrote all the documentation for their framework, which is 853, which is a few thousand controls versus the 110. And so with that background, I was working for a defense contractor and they said, hey, there's this thing called NIST 800-171. We've got to attest to our score. Can you guys take a day or two and get it done for us? And so we're like, hardcore DoD cyber guys, like, well, let's go do this thing and let's get it done in 2 days. We started looking at it and we quickly realized that this is not easy, right? And so it took us probably the better part of 3 to 6 months to get that done. And then we started hearing things like our partners who were much smaller or they were non-IT folks who were trying to do the same things that we were. And the question we asked ourselves, like, if it took us 3 to 6 months, a team of us, 5 people to do it, how are they have no clue about IT, they have no clue about cyber, and they're self-attesting, but we take like a look at it, like a 2-second glance at it, and we're like, this is all wrong, right? And primarily because we wanted to help our partners and our defense clients. And we stayed. The better part of like the past 6 or 7 years has been kind of trying to educate people on how to first understand this, how to scope things, and then how to properly document these things so that you're ready for assessment. So yeah, I've been doing it now
Perfect.
for about 7 years with 800-171, but yeah, it's been a good ride.
I think, like, I guess for some of the folks on the call, that have, they're thinking about getting into this, starting the process. I guess any other like things that you learned along the way, any, nuggets that we could pull out. Like how did you make this a repeatable process and not reinvent the wheel every single time you sat down and looked at a company that was subject to these requirements? I know easier said than done, but like how has your process evolved over time?
Um, Yeah, I think the biggest thing that we did was to really educate ourselves on, all the controls and all the assessment objectives. So first and foremost, if you're an MSP, MSSP trying to offer this, get to know all the controls and what they're looking for, right? So there's the CMMC assessment guides out there. Definitely recommend taking a look at those. Um, Take a look at your tool stack, right? Take a look at your internal processes. Understand that first and try to carve out for yourself, like, what is our approach to this, right? Like, how can I standardize what we do from a delivery standpoint, from a documentation standpoint, so that I can better support my clients, right? If you can make your internal processes more repeatable, then it's more repeatable for your clients as well, right? Um, I think that's the biggest thing, right? And then standardizing maybe the way you approach an assessment, right? So that way you're not missing things. Like these assessment scopes can get massive, right? Shadow IT is a real thing, right? Like you think the assessment, you talk to the IT folks, they're like, our scope is this. And then you dive a little bit deeper and you talk to maybe some of the folks in HR, like, oh, I've got this cloud service that I use sometimes, and I put the specs for this job in there. And then this other guy uses Dropbox sometimes because it's hard to get to it from his phone, right? And so really putting in place like, standard processes for yourself to ensure that you're not missing parts of the assessment, that you're understanding the scope fully. Um, it avoids you having to come back to it in the middle of assessment for something that you weren't expecting, right?
Absolutely. I know Will's doing double duty here and he's answering a bunch of Q&A questions while we're on this. Love to see that. We will have some more time to answer questions at the end as well. Gonna pivot back to, we're talking about repeatable process and scaling this. So gonna, pivot back to Cynomi selfishly for a couple minutes. For those who aren't aware, we did make a few key updates to the CMMC Level 2 module, if you will, within the Cynomi platform. Um, and Will, you were involved in some conversations with our engineering team. From your perspective as an assessor, um, I'm gonna jump into some screenshots, but I would love to hear your take on kind of where we are now. And the question that I get all the time: does an assessor actually care what tool we're using to track the implementation? Whatever they might be using.
Yeah, and I'll say, and here's, as an assessor, we fill out spreadsheets, right? What we have to submit is the DOW provided spreadsheets. So there are certain things that we can use ourselves internal and certain things that we have to use DOW spreadsheets for. And the reason I say that is tools don't matter in this space, right? And I say that in an assessor is not going to come in and log into your GRC and start pulling out evidence. So when you look at, SOC 2s and some of those, there's some platforms that, it'll do all the automation, get all the artifacts, and the assessor logs in on the back end. That doesn't happen in this. And so, with the engineering and development team, what I was talking about was, like automated SSP generation or those things. And so in the platform, my guidance was, don't generate the SSP fully because most of them I've seen, around the CMMC ecosystem, I've seen a lot of system generated SSPs and they're all horrible. And I don't mean to throw, it's the problem with an SSP is it's a narrative you've got to stand behind. This is what we do, right? So this is a document that gets submitted, and this is what is one of the lead things to the false claims that happen in this space is the SSP is really your narrative of what is done, and that's what the assessor starts off of. And so in the platform, the goal was to let you be able to track what you're doing, how it's implemented, and then have that in an easily exportable way. Because then the other thing is as consultants, different consultants have their own templates for system security plans. The NIST one from the NIST website is horrible, right? There's not enough detail on the NIST SSP. And I think it gives bad guidance because a lot of the fields you need are there, but it doesn't go into the objectives, right? It's more at the control level. And so when you start seeing these things that get lost using templates, that's why, my advice was provide all the information in a easy exportable way that can then be put into whichever platform. So if you go to a client that is using a certain platform or a certain SSP that they've been maintaining for the last 9 years since this started, then it's going to have to be put into their SSP. If it's a greenfield client just getting into the DIB and they don't have an SSP, then it's a little easier because you're starting from scratch. But based on as service providers, when we go out, we don't know what we're walking into. So the easiest way to do a repeatable form is here, let me just export all the information I have, and then I can put that into whatever format for whichever client.
Perfect. I think the other piece is evidence, right? I'm gonna pull up my screen so I can share that again for everybody. But from an evidence standpoint, um, going through an assessment, whether it's what you've done previously with DIBCAC assessments or anything kind of post CMMC. SSP and body of evidence, kind of separate documents, more common, or do you often find an assessor wanting to actually get into a client's environment like, hey, we're talking about access control, show me how you do this live in the system?
Yeah, so this is where CMMC kind of diverges from your traditional compliance is, there's 110 controls, 320 assessment objectives. But when we go into each assessment objective, we have to look at two things. And there's three different tests as an assessor. There's examine, which is a piece of paper, right? Interview, conversation, and a test. We have to do two out of three for every objective. And so, when you look at a CMMC assessment, 320 objectives, that's 640 pieces of evidence in either paper, interview, or actually having you do it. So, perfect example, you just talked about authentication when it says authorized users, unauthorized users can't log into the system, right? We're going to want you to log in with a bad user and see that it fails, right? So the guest accounts are disabled. um, that will be a test instead of a piece of paper. So a lot of the evidence, I know a lot of people want to get screenshots and things like that. We don't assess screenshots. Everything is either live interactive testing. We want you to show us reports or output or log into the system and show us. And if you do the screenshots ahead of time, that's really for you, right? To maybe remember where you got that evidence from and how to get back to it quickly. But most of the evidence that we're collecting is either going to be paper interviews, or having you demonstrate it live.
Yeah, perfect. All right, couple quick screenshots here of these updates that we've made in the platform. I'm going to sound like a bit of a nerd here if I haven't made myself sound like one already, but I love the SPRS widget that we added. This is a dynamic live look at where your client stands at any given time from an SPRS score perspective. So, if we're going to submit your current state, you would be at a negative 105. We've got some work to do. Here's where we're going to focus. So we have it as a widget, so it's easily available. But we also have a report for it, so that could be a recurring deliverable for clients in terms of kind of a progress report. Um, Another one that I thought, Will, you had an interesting take on, and I brought this up with a partner in Ohio this morning, who I believe is on the call. The addition of a POAM report. So there are some specific requirements throughout the certification process where a POAM is allowed or not allowed. There are some controls that are explicitly not POAMable. But you had a great take on using this as more of a project management tool. Do you care to just elaborate on that?
Sure. The first thing I want to do, there's two POAMs in CMMC, right? There's the POAM like this, and then there is the operational plan of action and milestones. And in the compliance space, a lot of times a POAM is this is going to be a control failure. That's it. So this control is not implemented. That's what's on the POAM. The operational plan is where you're doing all your risks, vulnerabilities, ranking those, fixing them, right? So the two POAMs. Uh, so this POAM within the platform can be a project tracking tool. And ultimately the reason I say that is when you get to 88 points, then you can be assessed. But then the kick to that is the 88 points, there should be no 3 or 5 point items remaining. So if all the threes and fives are done and everything that's left is 1 point and you're at 88, then at that point, a C3PAO can come in and assess. And so using this POAM as that tracker to be able to track, see how you're going, be able to make your notes and that's key. And then once you see that 88, you could probably run a mock assessment run through because you're going to have to show evidence of that because one of the controls is a controls assessment. So run through it and then you can actually schedule your assessment and if only 1 points are left between that 88 and 110.
Got it. It's a lot of information, but this will be recorded and available on the Cynomi partner portal for the interested folks. Um, Last but not least, we have our SPRS control implementation report. So this is just really a lot of detail showing how your client are meeting each of these controls. It's showing evidence notes, who's owning the process. So call back to shared responsibility between you and the client. Maybe these are controls that you're owning or sharing responsibility with your client. We're providing significant value here, but to Will's point, we're not automating an entire SSP. Like we touched on some of the platforms that are kind of stating or promising, hey, we'll be able to automate the system security plan for you. But I think Cynomi definitely gets you. I don't want to throw a percentage out there because I'm not, going through this in practice. But Mike, I think when you saw this for the first time, you were like, this is exactly how I would have built this if I did it myself.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, like Will said, this doesn't get you all the way there. There's still some things that you need to document. The evidence that you collect, you need to kind of put that into a register that it can be referenced back in during an assessment. But yeah, a lot of the problems or the long poles in the tent for us when it comes to assessment is getting through the questionnaires, right? Like asking the hundreds of questions across the multiple domains to get the answers we need. And so Cynomi has always been very good for that, like kind of guiding our team because, cyber people are pretty limited, so it's hard to find people to do it. So kind of having something to guide them through that process is very good, first and foremost, right? Then mapping those
Yeah.
things to a CMMC requirement, things like the SSP and the poems that are generated, while not completely there 100%, I felt like it got us, 80%, 75, 80% there, which is, hundreds of hours sometimes, so it's
Yeah.
great.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
So again, folks, if you haven't seen these three specific reports have been live in the platform since right around November. Um, so if you haven't seen this, you want to dive deeper into it, absolutely engage with your partner account manager. If it's me speaking for myself, always happy to jump on a screen share and walk through any of this with a partner. Um, I think we do, before we get in some questions, I think we have a survey that we'll put up on the screen, but also just a link to some of the resources that we've published in the Cynomi partner portal or on our website if you're not yet a partner. I think, James, you had a question around just additional resources available to folks who are going through this process. There's a lot out there, right? DoD or DOW CIO has their own landing page that I personally have bookmarked. Again, sorry for being such a nerd, but a ton of great resources there. It has links to the Cyber AB, ton of resources available from them. But engage in content like this. Speak to a third-party assessor. Attend events on the topic of CMMC to really get an understanding of the ins and outs and different perspectives that folks have. Again, there's a limited amount of third-party assessors in the ecosystem right now, and I think most of them agree on the vast majority of the controls and how they're implemented. But there's still things circulating that are kind of up for debate for certain topics. So this is something that is constantly evolving. There's resources available, so look for those sources of information for sure. And again, for anybody who's a partner, this checklist is available in the partner portal. All right, now the fun part. We got about 10 minutes left. I know we've been answering some questions. Um,
What one I want to answer that flew by, I was looking for it, but it was a paper
yeah.
one. Okay,
Oh
so
yeah.
there's been a recent guidance on companies that only use paper CY. Now, what that means from an assessor, just so that I can throw that hat on, is that means you receive your CUI through the mail, or you go pick it up at an office on paper. You bring it in, you do what you're going to do with that information, and then it leaves on paper. Okay. So there's no computer involved whatsoever. The When you have a computer system that you are then printing paper, that brings in the full requirements. And so with the question in the Q&A was about Prevail or a similar enclave solution where you're opening up a plan and then you're printing it. So that's where a lot of the scope, and it kind of answers one of the other questions in the Q&A was about scoping and missteps and assessment false starts. is if you go and say, we're using a cloud enclave and everything stays in this cloud enclave, nothing comes on-prem. But then you print something, you're now bringing it on-prem because for the enclave, you can't download or print, right? It stays in the cloud. And so when you're using a cloud enclave, and so once you bring that on premise, you're now bringing your premise in scope. And so with paper and printing and those things, that's why a lot of companies that we've helped, they'll look at an enclave solution, but then realize, oh, I need to download this plan to Mastercam or SolidWorks or something like that to work in it. And you can't do that. As soon as you do, your premise is now in scope. And so now you can't offload all those requirements to the service provider like you were planning. So scoping is key, but it's like I would say the number one document besides the SSP is going to be a data flow diagram, and it's really how the data comes in and how it leaves, even more so than a network diagram, which is also required. But when you look at that data flow, data in any medium, right? Paper, USB, download, website, basically how you're getting it, what you're doing to it, where it's going, and then what security controls are involved along that way, and how it changes form. So the thing as an assessor I like to see is I'm downloading this, and this is CUI, but then I'm generating, let's say, G code. Well, as long as your G code does not include any elements from the CUI information, then that G code has now been descoped. And so now when you go on that shop floor, you can do it without having the protections. There's been some huge debates on is G code CUI, but um, the fun things we do in the CMMC ecosystem is debate about paper and G code. But um, really that data flow diagram is where that scoping goes and where anything that it's touched along the way is in scope. But that hopefully that answers the question on the paper and some of the assessment false starts where we've seen missteps because we'll start reading these documents and say that doesn't work.
Right. There was a question, I guess, more Cynomi specific about being able to use assets stored in Cynomi for the CMMC effort. Yes, if you'd like to store assets in Cynomi and use that as the system of record and download that, CSV of assets, and even tie some of those specific assets to tasks. Absolutely something you can do. We've had the ability to do that in the platform for a while. And again, happy to walk through that use case with anyone. Um, I'm not sure if we answered it, but another one of my partners, and it was upvoted. AI and CMMC. I may be misremembering, but like, is Copilot available in GCC High now?
Now it is
So
now.
what's the stance on AI? And again, I would say, like, obviously huge rabbit hole we could go down here in terms of
It
just AI governance in general. But what are your
I,
thoughts?
I'll just put the way I look at it, and this is more of me being a previous CISO and those things is how are you using AI? Are you developing platforms that are using AI? Are you using AI to generate things, or are you using AI just in general business terms and worried about data going into it? When you put that lens on, if you're developing AI, then you start looking at the NIST, SDLC, and the software best practices. There's controls specifically in CMMC for development and source code management, those things. If you're using it as a product, like to enhance your own product or things like that, now you have to look at how is the data going in and is that data in your control? So when we start looking at Copilot, Gemini, or those, if you're in the government tenant, then those have been walled off. If they're available in the tenant, then you can use it because it stays in that data within your tenant. It doesn't go out to the web. But I would say it's an it depends. The number one answer in cybersecurity for any question is it depends. You really got to look at how it's used, what you're doing with it. Are you building products and really go through those lenses to then figure out AI in this area.
Perfect. Just another quick one from James. Any good forums or discords to discuss CMMC? I think there's a Cooey Discord. That's a pretty popular spot. I don't know. I
I
think I've seen you on Reddit, Will, on the CMMC Reddit.
I would say be careful on CMMC Reddit. There's a lot of bad advice there,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
I think the number one risk of business is bad advice. But the CMMC Reddit subreddit is there's good answers and there's bad answers and there's old answers. And so this ecosystem changes all the time. And like the Microsoft commercial versus GCC high. Most people don't know, or some people know, but the commercial used to be FedRAMP moderate, and that changed. And so there's government agencies that were on commercial that are now having to lift and shift. And so I would say yes, the CUI Discord is a good one. The SCF Discord, so the Secure Controls Framework. So with the Cyber AB. When you go to the AB's website, there's also the SCF ecosystem. There's an SCF Discord, a lot of good resources. And yeah, I just say be careful because if you're asking
Yeah.
questions in some of those spaces, there's a lot of bad answers.
I've seen people kind of self-correct and get called out. There's some voices in the ecosystem that like to call people out for being wrong. So there's always going to be the the cooey police. Great point on Microsoft as well. Another again, I'm sounding like such a nerd here, guys. But I have the Microsoft 365 government blog bookmarked. I know I've shared that with partners. This is from them saying here is how we're attesting to commercial GCC high. It is a lengthy blog post. But the other thing to think about is how you're actually going to procure those licenses if you have a client that needs it. There's if you're going to kind of act as a reseller potentially, it's a little different than, the CSP program. So there's limited places that you can actually purchase those from authorized resellers, and I believe Pax8 does have the ability to sell GCC high as well. But it is a question
Uh,
that has come up with some folks recently.
PAX 8 can do GCC, the moderate. PAX 8 is not an ASOG for the high. I have not seen that you can get. I could be wrong, someone correct me, but I have not seen GCC high available from PAX. There's only like
Yeah, and then there's
30 ASOGs in the world.
yeah. So that was again the company I came from. We were on that list, and it was a massive advantage that we had. I'll tell you that. Um, I guess the other like on that topic, like I mean, again, we could keep going and going. We're at time here. We'll answer some of the questions. Justin did say GCC High
Yeah,
is available from
I see
PAX
that.
8. Cool. So we will do our best to answer the questions that weren't answered live. If you are a partner, engage with your partner account manager. Appreciate everybody's time and sticking with us, the participation in the Q&A. Um, but I guess for those who are willing to stick around, just from you guys, one final key thought. Like if you could give one piece of advice, like in one sentence for folks on the webinar, what would it be, Mike?
I would say get involved in the ecosystem. This thing changes so much and so frequently that you have to stay connected. There's folks like myself, there's Will out here, but many others who are here to help. If this is something you're going to get into, I strongly recommend partnering, either becoming an RPO yourselves and getting educated on CMMC or partnering with one. And definitely partner with a C3 PAO so that way you know what the end looks like so that you can prepare yourselves better for that. So,
Perfect.
yeah.
Will?
Yep, I would say this is definitely the right place to be. The CUI categories that National Archives put together encompasses a lot of laws and regulations that are not under DOW. And so NIST, when it was written, it was for all CUI, not just DOW. And so we've already seen Department of Energy require this on contracts. And when you look at the list, you're going to they're on that list for CUI. You've got FERPA, HIPAA, CGIS, all of those. And in the last administration, we actually saw an RFI out of the White House to consolidate cyber frameworks within the Fed. And so In my opinion, from what I see in the ecosystem, now that we have DOW and Department of Energy both on this, that I would actually see a lot of the federal compliance space collapsing onto CMMC, especially when you see the shrinking in the agencies and the assessments that they do internal with different departments. And so, since with CMMC, this is the first shift of going to government run but industry managed compliance. And so, I would say it's a perfect time to get in, starting with DOW. I think DOW is the guinea pigs in this. And I think once that's proven out, we now see the shift for the assessors going Keiko, the assessment side for instructors and assessors moving over to ISACA. That's a global move. And so I think as this ecosystem grows, you're going to start seeing all those other regulations that you've dealt with like GLBA, FIFEC, all of that start collapsing into the same 171 and CMMC ecosystem. So that's my prediction hat. Take it for what you will, but the NARA registry includes all of those regulations.
Great stuff. Um, all right, we got to cut this off at some point. So I think I appreciate. I mean, 70 of you stayed on here till the bitter end. So appreciate it. Um, we will be in touch if you've asked us to be in touch, and hope to have some more of these conversations in the future. I appreciate you guys' time and
Yeah,
expertise. Absolutely.
it's a pleasure.
All right. Take care, everyone. Thanks again.
Thanks.
All right, thanks, guys.